When I started to suspect that my wife was planning a divorce, my gut told me something was being set up behind my back. I decided to discreetly protect my assets before it was too late. What I found afterward went far beyond my initial suspicions. My name is Mason Richards. I'm 32 years old. I work as a software engineer in Charlotte, North Carolina. And up until the end of last winter, I used to wake up with the certainty that I had married my best friend. Sophia and I were a team that just worked. She left to teach elementary school at 7:15. I headed to the office at 8:30, and we'd always meet at 7 p.m. sharp for dinner. We had the life I'd always wanted. Simple, predictable, built on a mutual trust that felt unshakable. At least until she started smiling at her phone in a way she no longer smiled at me. You know that feeling when you realize someone is slipping away from you in slow motion? The shift started subtly in March, when she began waking up 15 minutes earlier to fix her hair properly. She bought makeup she'd never used before, casually saying it was probably time to take better care of herself, after years of focusing solely on work. At first I felt proud. I thought she was finally valuing herself after years of pouring into those kids at school. But something about it felt performative, like she was getting ready for an invisible audience I couldn't quite place. It felt like someone rehearsing for a role without knowing what play was about to start. The first real crack in our transparency happened on a Thursday, when her phone rang during dinner. She got up with an "I need to take this" that sounded strangely rehearsed, different from the natural tone she'd always used. For 5 years, our phones were basically shared. We knew each other's passcodes, used them freely, no drama. That kind of effortless intimacy you only build when you truly trust someone was starting to vanish for no clear reason. Now she would walk into the bedroom, close the door gently, and I could hear her voice shift into that warm tone she used to use only with me. The calls always lasted longer than seemed necessary for work stuff. When I asked who called, she had the answer ready. Jennifer from work, about tomorrow's parent meeting. Anyone who's been in a relationship knows that pit in your stomach when something feels off but you can't quite put your finger on it. I still wasn't ready to name the uneasy feeling growing inside me. The suspicion turned into certainty on a Monday afternoon when I came home early from work because of a canceled meeting. I found her in our bedroom, talking on the phone with the door slightly open, her voice carrying a kind of intimacy I hadn't heard in months. "I know it sounds complicated, but I need to do this the right way," she was saying, pacing nervously. When she saw me in the doorway, she jumped and quickly ended the call with a "we'll talk later." Her behavior changed drastically after that day. Her phone was now constantly in her hand, and the calls started happening with suspicious frequency. During dinner, she'd check her messages nonstop, sometimes smiling in a way that made me wonder when was the last time she smiled like that at me. The emotional manipulation was subtle, but constant. Every time I asked about something, she flipped it around and questioned if I was okay. The evasiveness around our future plans reached an almost absurd level. When I mentioned our summer trip, she said, "Maybe it's better to wait." When I brought up remodeling the kitchen, she replied, "A lot could change by then." Watching someone live one day at a time, avoiding any conversation about long-term commitments, that sensation of being around someone who's physically present but already has one foot out the door. That Thursday, after a week of watching this relationship drama unfold, something inside me shifted. Watching her text someone while pretending to listen to me, seeing that distant smile when she thought I wasn't looking, it was then I realized it was no longer a matter of if, but what was being planned. That night, staring at the ceiling while she slept peacefully beside me, I made the decision that would change everything. The time had come to find out the truth and protect myself from what was coming. The next day, I called James Wilson, my friend from college and now a family law attorney here in Charlotte. "James, I need some off-the-record advice," I said, trying to keep my voice casual while my mind was still processing the weight of the situation. I explained the changes in her behavior, the mysterious phone calls, the increasing evasiveness. James listened silently and asked a question that sent a chill down my spine. "Mason, do you know where your main assets are right now?" During lunch, while she was teaching, I went to the bank and requested detailed statements from our accounts over the past 6 months. What I found made me question how many other things I had missed, simply because I trusted blindly. Small recurring transfers, withdrawals that didn't match our routine, transactions that seemed harmless on their own, but together formed a very clear pattern. The financial betrayal in marriage was right there in black and white. Someone had been methodically preparing a parallel life. That night after she fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and began to act preemptively. James had been clear. If you suspect something's coming, you need to protect yourself. Legally. I created a full list of our assets. The house, investments, emergency fund, even the car in my name. Cataloging an entire life like that, reducing years of shared building into a cold spreadsheet, brought a strange sense of clarity. By that point, I wasn't thinking with my heart, I was thinking survival. The hardest decision was involving my mom, Linda, in the process. On Thursday, I drove to her house and explained everything. "Mom, I need to transfer some assets into your name temporarily," I said, watching her expression shift from confusion to maternal concern. Linda had always liked her, so it was hard for her to process that my wife might be planning something destructive. When I showed her the bank statements and explained the behavioral patterns, she understood this wasn't about suspicion anymore. Over the next week, while keeping our daily routine perfectly normal on the surface, I worked quietly in the background. I transferred most of our savings into an account in my mother's name, documented every suspicious transaction I had uncovered, and set up real-time financial monitoring. I felt like I was preparing for a conflict I hoped I'd never have to face. Watching her smile at her phone during dinner that Friday, I felt something cold settle in my chest. The preparation was done, and I was ready for whatever came next. The following Wednesday, she came home with a proposal that sounded strangely rehearsed. "Mason, honey, I've been thinking a lot about our financial organization," she said, pulling up a chair to sit beside me at the kitchen table. "Maybe it's time we separate our individual accounts more clearly from the household expenses, so we can have better control over our personal spending." The way she spoke felt like it had been practiced in the mirror, every word carefully chosen. She brought documents, papers organized in folders, printed spreadsheets, even specific suggestions about which accounts to keep joint and which to separate. "Where did you get all this information?" I asked, flipping through materials that seemed way too professional for a spontaneous idea. "Oh, a friend recommended some articles on financial planning for couples," she replied, avoiding eye contact. Watching someone follow a script I hadn't seen before, but that clearly existed. The level of detail in her proposal was disturbingly impressive. There were specific suggestions about contribution percentages, implementation timelines, even templates for financial separation agreements within marriage. "Is this friend of yours an accountant or something?" I asked, trying to understand how someone would have access to such technical info. "No, she just went through a similar situation and learned a lot about it." The answer came too quickly, like she'd been prepared for that exact question. In the days that followed, I started noticing a more systematic pattern in the bank activity I had observed earlier. These weren't just random small withdrawals. There was a clear methodology behind each transaction. Transfers always on Tuesdays and Fridays, amounts ranging from $150 to $300, always during specific times when she knew I'd be in meetings. Someone had mapped out a detailed schedule for these financial movements. The financial betrayal in marriage I was witnessing had a level of precision that suggested professional guidance, not just personal impulses. Every move seemed calculated to avoid immediate suspicion, but collectively represented significant amounts. Observing someone execute a long-term strategy, where each small action contributed to a bigger goal I couldn't quite see yet, it felt like I was only seeing the tip of the iceberg, of something far more elaborate. What disturbed me most was finding out she had opened a personal bank account without telling me. I discovered it when a piece of mail from the bank arrived addressed only to her, at a time I normally would have been at work. "It's just a small savings account for personal emergencies," she explained when I casually asked about any new accounts. "Nothing major, I just wanted to have an independent reserve." The timing, though, was a little too convenient to be a coincidence. The ease with which she talked about financial independence and personal savings stood in stark contrast to the 5 years of total transparency we had always shared. Throughout our entire relationship, we discussed every financial change, no matter how small. Now suddenly she was making unilateral decisions and framing them as normal precautions. It became obvious that these changes weren't happening in isolation. There was a new mindset being fed by external influences. The confirmation of my suspicions came on a Thursday night, when I overheard fragments of a phone call she made from the bathroom. "Yes, I'm following exactly what you said. He's not suspecting anything yet. Next week we start phase 2. Her voice had a confidence I hadn't heard in months, like she was getting constant validation for her decisions. It became clear that someone was coordinating these changes, giving her a detailed roadmap that she was following religiously. Later that week, while organizing some papers, I found a handwritten note tucked between her books. Timeline, week 1-2, distancing, week 3-4, financial restructuring, week 5-6, final prep. It wasn't her handwriting. It was more angular, masculine. Someone had created a specific timeline for what exactly? The realization that my life was being planned out by a third party I didn't even know, but who clearly had very specific objectives in mind. Over the weekend, watching her interact with me like nothing was wrong while constantly checking her phone, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a distant wife anymore. Dealing with someone following a systematic plan, with outside guidance and goals that clearly didn't include my well-being. The truth became undeniable that this wasn't about our marriage problems anymore. This was about a calculated operation where I was just another piece on someone else's chessboard. The time had come to figure out exactly who was moving those pieces and why. The following Monday, I woke up with a mental clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The next step she had mentioned was coming today, but this time, I would be ready. I called James at 8 a.m. and simply said, "Today's the day. I need to implement our strategy." He understood immediately. After weeks of watching her systematic moves, it was time to execute my own plan. The husband outsmarts cheating wife narrative was about to take a very unexpected turn. She left for work at 7:15 as usual, but today there was a different energy, a kind of anxiety disguised as excitement that confirmed my suspicions. As soon as I heard the car pull out of the driveway, I put into motion everything James and I had prepared. Step 1. Document every piece of evidence. I took photos of the notes I'd found, the suspicious bank statements, especially that handwritten timeline in a masculine script. Every piece of proof would be critical for what came next. The second move was implementing protective measures once and for all. James had already prepared the paperwork to transfer the house and major investments into my mother Linda's name. "Son, are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked at the attorney's office at 10 a.m. "Mom, if I'm wrong, I can reverse it. But if I'm right and don't act, I'll lose everything we built." Linda signed with the expression of someone who understood that protecting assets before divorce was a necessity, not revenge. James made the call he had promised, to a contact of his at the Financial Crimes Division. Mason, my guy there, said there are other similar cases under investigation, identical behavior, same pattern of systematic manipulation. That information completely shifted my perspective on the situation. "You mean I'm not the only one going through this?" "Exactly. There's an active investigation into potential organized marital fraud here in Charlotte." Come mid-afternoon, James called me again. "Investigator Michelle Davis wants to speak with you today. Apparently your wife may be connected to Damian Fisher, a guy they've been monitoring for months." When I arrived at the station, I discovered something that turned my personal anger into systemic outrage. There was a file with at least 10 similar cases, men reporting identical behavior from their wives, all following the same script of staged emotional distancing and rehearsed financial restructuring. "Mr. Richards, Damian Fisher created a network where he convinces married women they're victims of limiting relationships," Investigator Davis explained. "He provides a detailed manual on how to dissolve marriages for profit, charging a percentage of the assets they recover in the process." The true story of divorce revenge I thought I was living was actually part of something far more sinister. She wasn't just betraying me emotionally, she was following instructions from a criminal operation. When I arrived home at 6 p.m., I found her in the kitchen with a smile I hadn't seen in months. "Honey, we need to have an important talk," she said, exactly as I had anticipated. The second phase of the timeline was beginning. Sure, but first I need to show you something. I laid out the bank statements, the notes, the handwritten timeline, and finally, Investigator Davis's business card. The police already know about Damian Fisher and his entire operation. The change on her face was instant. Confidence turned to full-blown panic. Mason, I can explain everything. It's not what it looks like. You followed a 6-week playbook to dissolve our marriage under the guidance of a man under investigation for fraud. What exactly am I supposed to think? The divorce lawyer twist was complete. I hadn't just stayed ahead of her actions. I had stayed ahead of an entire criminal scheme she'd become part of. I showed her the asset transfer documents signed that morning. Our house, investments, everything is now in my mother's name. You executed the plan perfectly, but I had a plan of my own. The manipulative wife exposed situation was unfolding just as intended, but with the added dimension of potentially protecting other couples from falling into the same trap. She had become both a victim and an accomplice in a predatory system. Later that evening, she tried one last emotional card. Tears, apologies, promises that she could fix everything because she'd been misled by someone manipulative. But it was too late for emotional manipulation in marriage to work. Tomorrow morning, Investigator Davis is going to call you. They want your cooperation in taking down the entire network. Your next choices will decide whether you walk away from this as a victim or as an accomplice. Watching her process the reality of the situation, I realized this revenge story had grown into something far bigger, a pursuit of justice that might save other families from going through the same nightmare. The next morning, she woke up completely different, not the confident woman who had planned to catch me off guard, but someone who had clearly spent the night processing the magnitude of the situation. "We need to talk about yesterday," she said while making coffee, her trembling hands nearly spilling the mug. "I know it looks terrible, but you need to understand I never meant to hurt you intentionally." Fascinating to observe how the narrative betrayal she had orchestrated was now turning against her. The manipulative spouse behavior I had documented for weeks was now exposed in the harsh light of morning. Around 10 a.m., Investigator Davis called as promised. I was in the office, but I could hear fragments of the conversation, her tone shifting between defensive and apologetic. "Yes, I know him. No, I didn't know it was illegal. I thought it was just life coaching." When the call ended after nearly an hour, I found my wife sitting at the kitchen table staring at the phone like it was a freshly diffused bomb. "They want me to come in tomorrow for a formal statement." The afternoon brought the first wave of social consequences I hadn't fully anticipated. Jennifer Phillips, a close friend and fellow teacher, showed up at our door looking shaken. "He contacted me last week, said you recommended me as someone who could benefit from his services." The look on my wife's face was pure horror, realizing she wasn't just a client but had unknowingly become a recruiter for the system. "Jen, I swear I didn't know he was doing this to other people." At dinner, we tried to keep up a semblance of normalcy, but the tension was thick. "I know you must think I'm a horrible person," she said, pushing food around her plate without eating. "I genuinely believed I was doing something to improve my life. Our life. The problem isn't that you wanted to improve. The issue is that you followed a manual to destroy ours without giving me a chance to be part of the conversation." It became clear that this Reddit marriage betrayal had layers neither of us fully understood in the beginning. The true turning point came Thursday, when she received a call from Amanda Cross, the wife of another man named in the investigation. "Your friend called me and said you could help me with my marriage problems," Amanda said, her voice laced with fury. "Do you have any idea what that man did to my family?" My wife spent 20 minutes listening as Amanda described how the manipulator had convinced her to follow the same playbook, devastating not just her husband financially, but their children too. I didn't know he was doing this to other families. On Friday night, she made a decision that honored her character, but sealed our fate for good. "I'm going to fully cooperate with the investigation. I'll turn over all the messages, recordings, everything that might help stop what he's doing." She paused, looking straight at me with red, tear-stained eyes. "But I understand if you can't forgive me. I understand if this is the end for us." The moment I had both feared and anticipated, when we both acknowledged that some betrayals, even unintentional, change a relationship forever. The weekend was spent handling the practical parts of our separation. She would temporarily move to her sister's house in Raleigh while the investigation continued, and we figured out our next legal steps. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" she asked while packing her clothes Sunday afternoon. Forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. I might eventually forgive you for being manipulated, but I can't stay married to someone who made such fundamental decisions about our future without including me. The most honest conversation we'd had in months. Monday brought an unexpected call from Brian Tucker, a colleague whose marriage had imploded following a pattern eerily similar to mine. "The investigator gave me your contact. Said you might have info about what happened to my family too." Surreal to realize this story had become part of a much larger pattern affecting multiple couples across Charlotte. The family betrayal I had experienced wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic operation. By the end of that week, with her officially cooperating and temporarily in another city, I found myself alone in our home after 5 years. The legal justice I had been pursuing was taking shape, but not the way I imagined. Instead of personal satisfaction, I felt a mix of grief over what we had lost and a sense of resolve to ensure other couples wouldn't have to go through the same. That Friday night, sitting in the empty living room, I realized this story had evolved into something bigger than personal revenge. It had become about protecting other families from predatory manipulation disguised as empowerment. The silence was deep, but after months of tension, it felt more like peace than emptiness. 6 months later, sitting on the porch of my new home in Davidson, a small town 40 minutes from Charlotte, I received a letter that would change my perspective on this whole experience. It was from Patricia Miller, a woman in Asheville who had read about the case in the local papers when the manipulation network was finally dismantled. "Mr. Richards, I wanted you to know that your testimony helped my family avoid the same fate. My husband had begun to notice similar changes in me, and when he showed me the articles about your case, we realized I was being manipulated by the same type of coach. Thank you for having the courage to expose it." Reading those words, I finally felt that the pain had served something greater than my own healing. The quiet revenge divorce story I thought I was living had turned into something entirely different, in protection and prevention for other families. Damian Fisher was sentenced to 8 years in prison for marital fraud and systematic manipulation, and the investigation revealed he had affected more than 60 couples across 3 states. She kept her word and fully cooperated with authorities, providing crucial evidence that helped build the case. She moved to Portland last fall, starting a new career as a counselor for victims of emotional manipulation, a form of redemption I respected, even though I wasn't part of it. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and letting justice follow its natural course. My routine now is simple, but fulfilling. I work remotely for a medtech startup based in Austin, spend Saturday mornings helping my mother Linda with gardening, and dedicate a few hours each week responding to emails from people who have been through similar experiences. James is still my lawyer and now one of my closest friends. It was him who helped me find this house, a place where silence isn't emptiness, but peace. Brian Tucker and I meet monthly for coffee. We joke we've formed a very specific club that we hope never needs new members. Some days, when the silence gets too loud, I read Patricia's letter again, and others that have arrived over the months, reminding me that something genuinely good came out of all that. The house we once shared was sold, and the proceeds split equally, not out of legal obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. The protecting assets before divorce I began as a defensive measure ended up protecting us both from a situation that could have been financially devastating. This true story didn't end with dramatic revenge or bitter endings, but with the understanding that sometimes the most profound victories come from choosing healing over hatred, justice over vengeance, and peace over prolonged pain. And in that, I finally found not just closure, but a completely new way of understanding what it means to truly move forward. And now, I speak directly to you. Yes, you, the one who stayed with me through this journey. Have you ever gone through something similar in your marriage? Have you noticed signs of emotional manipulation, or found out your spouse was following someone else's script to dismantle your relationship? Share your experience in the comments. I want to know how you dealt with marital manipulation and if you ever had to make hard decisions to protect your assets from someone who was supposed to love you. If this story touched you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Every day I share real stories of people who turned marriage betrayal into opportunities to rebuild through truth and genuine justice. Just like I learned that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living well after betrayal, you too can discover that your true strength doesn't lie in what others do to you, but in what you choose to build for yourself after the storm.